a very warm welcome, everyone, to this third session of our seminar series, Forms, Fragments and Fractures in Contemporary Women's Life Writing. Today's session on postmodern autobiographies will turn to women's life writing on the point of and in the wake of May 68. We're really delighted to be welcoming Vilma, Maria and Álvaro today, our three fantastic colleagues who are doing really pioneering work in the field. So thank you very much to all three of you for being here today. So we'll keep to the format of the previous two sessions, and I'll give a very brief introduction to today's panel, and then I'll hand over to Raquel to introduce our three speakers, and we'll have our usual Q&A at the end. And just to remind everyone, the session is being recorded, so during the Q&A, if you do want to ask a question but you don't want to be recorded, you can always type it in the chat and we can read it out for you. So, as I said, today's session will be on postmodern autobiographies, and as well as a crucial period of social and political transformation and artistic experimentation that spread across the world. The late 1960s, 70s and 80s were, of course, decisive decades in the formation of autobiography studies as a field. Informed by postmodernist and post-structuralist reconceptualizations of subjectivity, the shift from second to third wave theory saw the emergence of radical new definitions of autobiographical selves and practices, fueled by the publications in the mid-1970s of key texts and key concepts, including Philippe Lejeune's Autobiographical Pact, Serge Dubrovsky's understanding of autofiction, and pioneering autobiographical experiments, including Roland Barthes' Roland par Roland Barthes. The 1980s in particular was a decade instrumental in shining a light on the significance in the field of works by women and minoritized writers. Yet the majority of the most widely cited critical voices and case studies from this period are Francophone and Anglophone. And these formative decades have played a pivotal role in establishing the focal points of the international discussion right up to the present day, even as the range of case studies considered under the umbrella of the autobiographical life writing has continued to expand. It is no coincidence that Spain, Portugal, and Italy, which remain largely underrepresented in said discussions, were experiencing during these decades significant internal socio-political turmoil against the backdrop of that in Europe more widely. As Portugal and Spain were negotiating in the mid-1970s the turbulence of the final years of and transitions from long-standing repressive regimes, Italy was caught in the violent upheavals of the Anni di Piombo, or the Years of Lead. Today's panel will explore the responses to these dramatic changes, to the tempestuous fluctuations between constraint and liberation, and to the newfound social and literary freedoms in women's life writing of the period, through the lens of the diverse autobiographical forms to which Ana Maria Ortese, Natália Correia, and Cristina de Areilza turn. And Raquel, over to you to introduce our speakers.
Thank you, Hani. It's a pleasure to be back. It's a pleasure to see all faces. We have shared wonderful sessions last week and the first one. So our first speaker of today is Álvaro González Montero. Álvaro is a PhD researcher at the University of Leeds. His thesis is titled Illness and Queerness in Spain, Spanish Life Writing from 1936 to the Present, and is funded by the AHRC via the White Rose College of the Arts and Humanities. His research interests include Spanish and Catalan life writing of illness, social history, queer historical memory, and medical humanities. One of his latest articles focuses on AIDS in Jaime Gil de Biedma's diaries and was published in Journal of Spanish Cultural Studies. Thank you, Álvaro. Thank you for being here.
Thank you very much, Raquel, for having me here and for inviting me to present this wonderful seminar. And I'm going to just share my screen to start talking about Cristina Areilza's Diario de una rebeldía, Writing the Inner Monster. I'll translate the title in a minute for those of you who might not speak Spanish. In this presentation, I'm going to try and examine Cristina Areilza's diary writing practice and reflect a bit upon the relationship between writing diaries and illness in this author in particular. And then I'm going to look at three themes that run through the diary: leukemia and its forms, transference and the hospital setting, and also I'm going to be looking into the idea of autobiography and how that applies. We can apply that to Cristina Areilza's work. Now, Cristina Areilza is an interesting author in that her biographical details are generally not very clear. There's scarce information about her. I know that she was a journalist. She was a daughter to a very well-known Francoist politician, who then also was a sort of politician during the Spanish democracy as well, José María de Areilza. She worked for El País, although seemingly in a sort of freelance way, from what I've been able to gather. According to the diary's blurb, she started her literary and journalistic career with interview and short stories in the Madrid press. I haven't been able to find any of those interviews or short stories yet. I need to do archival work because these will be around the 80s and probably in El País, to which we only have limited access from my desktop computer. The only details online about her herself, the only things you can really find are her obituary and also a small piece in El País about her diaries, the publication of her diaries in the year 1983. And she only wrote, as far as I know, one published book, which was Diario de una rebeldía. Also biographically, this is a bit of kind of gossip, but I thought because we have such few details, it might be relevant. She had a relationship with Fernando Sánchez Dragó, about which he writes in his autobiography. He writes bits and pieces, quite sexist, quite misogynistic, the way he was, unfortunately. But there are some bits that are interesting about Cristina Areilza. He says that her diary was a diary of an ill woman who would not resign herself to be it. And he also talks a little bit about her family situation. Basically, she didn't get on with her family. And I think this was to do with the politics of the family being very sort of Francoist and conservative, and her own politics, which seemed to be a little more on the progressive side. So he says here that she didn't get on with her mother or her father or her older sister, who also, her sister was involved, was married to some politician at the time. Now, the diary itself. It was published in the year 1983 by Selecciones Australes Pasacalpe, quite a very decent publisher for such a rare text, for such a very distinctive text. It has a prologue by Pedro Laín Entralgo. Now, Pedro Laín Entralgo was a psychiatrist, but also a polymath. He wrote about all sorts of things. He wrote his own memoirs in the year 1976. And he prologues the diary. And I'll talk a little bit more about what he says in the prologue in a minute. The contents, the dates of the contents of the diaries, the date of the narrative, go from 1982, the 27th of February 1982, to the 14th of May 1982. But the diary wasn't published until 1983. And it hasn't been republished ever since. The title is interesting. The title translates literally as Diary of a Rebelliousness. And to be honest, in Spanish, it strikes the idea of the title strikes us as a bit strange, because you might think Diario de una rebelde, Diary of a rebellious woman, or Diary of a rebellion, Diario de una rebelión. But no, it's a Diario de una rebeldía. At this point, I'm not sure what to make of that exactly. Probably she was focusing on the process that she narrates so much in depth. But it's interesting, the choice of title. Also, the publication is 1983, which is in the middle of the Spanish, or middle of the end, depending on how you take it. But it's at a very particular time of the Spanish transition to democracy. It's which started in the year 1975 with the death of Francisco Franco, and kind of culminates with the first elected socialist government in Spain. But it is in this period of deep political changes in the country. In that sense, I did a bit of literature review. I'm not going to go through all of this in detail. There's actually very little written about Cristina Areilza. I found a book review in the journal Cultura dos Cuidados, a nursing journal, that reviews quite thoroughly the diary. But it's a bit of a strange genre to have in a scientific journal. So I'm not sure what to make of it. But it is that. And this is recent. I forgot to put the date there, but it's in the 2000s. Also, Maria Jose Blanco and Sinead Wall mentioned the book in their introduction to an issue of the Journal of Roman Studies, but they only mention it. The book is then not sort of analyzed in any of the articles in that issue. The book is also analyzed to some depth in a section of a PhD thesis from the year 2012 by Natália Fernandez-Diaz, which the whole thesis focuses on the metaphors for leukemia. The title is down there in my slide. And one of the metaphors this author talks about is Areilza's ones about leukemia. But the focus is heavily in the idea of metaphor, which is present, but I think there's a bit more that we can do with this text. Also, I wanted to mention that Audre Lorde's cancer journals are a clear precedent, although I'm not sure that Cristina Areilza read them. Also, they're very different. Lorde's focuses on breast cancer. Areilza focuses on leukemia. But still, I think, within the literature of cancer, of diaries of cancer, it's certainly an important one. And also, there might be, I reckon, a certain inspiration from Gil de Viedma's Retrato del Artista Enfermo. That was an excerpt of Gil de Viedma's diaries that were published in 1964. And they are basically the diaries of tuberculosis after he comes back from the Philippines in 1956. Again, I think that might be a source of inspiration for Areilza. She must have known Gil de Viedma's writing, because it was fairly popular at the time. So I wouldn't be surprised if there was some inspiration there. Right. Key themes that I'm going to try and talk about. Again, this presentation, perhaps I haven't said it yet, but I am basically opening some ways to which we can look at this diary, and I intend to do so in future papers. But there's, as I said, there's so little written about it that I haven't had that much to take from other people, basically, and I'm doing all the work here pretty much. So the key themes that I see in the diary are the theme of illness, leukemia, its phenomenology, that is the symptoms of leukemia, the metaphors that she uses to talk about the symptoms, but also the symptoms themselves, which are quite explicit throughout the diary. There's also, and in this I follow line entral prologue, the idea of transference, which she also mentions a bit in the diary from a psychoanalytic point of view. And I'll talk a little bit more about this in a minute. And finally, as I said, the idea of autobiography. Now, leukemia, the inner monster, this whole thing about the inner monster was very interesting, and I'll come to it in a minute. But she was diagnosed with leukemia in February 1982. And she says that she wrote the diary from the first day in which she was diagnosed up to the day when she reached the point of remission in the process. And the word cancer really does not appear until quite late in that, at least 20 pages in or so. The illness, it's talked about at the beginning in vaguer terms. Then in page 97, for example, she says, oh, it was like a dream and now I'm awake to the reality that surrounds me, and it's this kind of leukemia. She uses a cliche at the end, and this is where I took my title from. She uses a cliche about Goethe, something about writing the inner monster. And if someone in the audience knows more about this, I'd be really grateful to hear, because I've been asking people around and no one's been able to tell me exactly where in Goethe I can find this reference. And I can't read German myself, so unfortunately that's not. I believe, though, that she's not really quoting directly from Goethe, and my sense is that she's referring to a certain cliche about Goethe saying this thing about writing you have to write your inner monster to sort of fight against it. I reckon this idea is connected to Freud's notions of unconscious trauma, which once is brought out in analysis, it would alleviate the subject. As I said, the effort to write the illness involves a thorough description of symptoms, and the metaphor of battle, war is used all the time throughout the narrative, from the very beginning up to the very end. That keeps coming up a lot. Transference is another important theme, and Lain Entralgo highlights it. Transference basically, in psychoanalytic terms, is a relationship between the analyst and the patient. And in theory, in psychoanalysis, that is the way that the cure is enacted. Now, I'm not sure. I guess when Lain Entralgo talks about transference applied to the diary, is because the Areilza is writing her life, and through that, there's a certain sense of transference. But also, she establishes really interesting and sometimes funny relationships with the doctors that treat her. She basically fancies them a lot. She wants them in the room. She says she feels sexy for them. Sometimes she hates them with a passion and doesn't want to see them anymore. So there's the relationship she establishes with them is really strong. Now, I haven't mentioned this, but she was basically put in isolation in this hospital in Paris throughout the time of the treatment. And that, of course, had an impact on the way she felt about human contact, which she didn't have as much. There's a lot of emphasis in that sense on the psychological or mental health aspect of illness. She says that her suffering is not physical anymore. She says this halfway through the diary. However, loneliness and isolation and lack of affection hurt a lot. She also talks about using illness. She says that you have to make the most of illness so that they pay attention to you at work. She wanted to publish some piece of writing, and apparently advice had shown interest, and she was using the fact that she was ill for that, which is interesting, I think. And also sexuality. There's a lot of it, really, not necessarily in very explicit terms, but it's quite open at the same time. She says things like a doctor told her she was gonna shake everybody with her sexy t-shirts, and that really made her feel great because she felt like she could still be seductive despite being an ill person, despite having leukemia. Finally, the concept of autobiography I wanted to talk about. Now, Cusa, in his Recovering Bodies, uses this term to refer to autobiographical accounts of medical training and personal narratives of illness that reveal how medical discourse may alienate doctors from patients and patients from their body and their bodily experience. There's a lot of this in Cristina Areilza's diary. She criticizes heavily the medical establishment, both doctors, the hospital, the treatment. She says things like this quote, "I realize I'm not free. I'm not free in nature, but in a hospital ward, blocked up everywhere. it's precisely this nightmare that I cannot understand. Just says here, I'm but an ill woman, submissive and docile. There are also some ideas connected to Ivan Illich's concept of iatrogenesis, this idea that it's the very medical establishment that causes the ill sometimes, or that or the treatment that causes it. This is things like also says things like this illness has helped me break with many things that were tormenting me and now have no importance. She also puts the ill person at the forefront of the narrative. She says the ill person has a different view of things. They feel a passive protagonist of the illness and spectator of their own suffering. So even if she puts the ill person in a sort of passive role, still she grants them a different vision of things, and that's interesting, actually. As I said, she talks really in really negative terms sometimes about hospital. Hospital is both a place of healing. This short year has been the most enriching of all my existence, she says, or of death and entrapment. Why don't they let me live a year or however many years in peace? Afterwards, I only wish for a sweet death next to the sea, without hospital beds, without doctors, without treatments. Let nature act freely. She does have quite a streak of sort of freedom sometimes. In one piece, in the little piece that comes up in El País, about the book, she says, I've got rid of the maintenance medication, although the doctors weren't really in agreement. I just need to go back to normal life. Medication destroys you. And this sounded to me really, this was really interesting to me, because it sounds quite like some people when they talked about COVID back during the pandemic, and still nowadays, I think. And I think even if we may disagree with this idea, I think it's still often found in these testimonies of ill people. Just to conclude, I think this is a unique diary of cancer, a time of profound changes in Spanish society. And I think we can look at it from three different approaches. One phenomenological one, day-to-day view of the ill person, their symptoms, etc., etc. A more psychoanalytic approach, like Lain and Dralgo kind of points at, talking about this sense of clarity, this transference, etc. And also using the idea of autobiography through the experience of symptoms and the writing about them, and writing about the experience of the hospital and the medical establishment, which is ultimately presented in the case of Cristina Areilza as both helpful and hurtful. And I would like in future to try and bring together these three perspectives and see what they can tell us about Cristina Areilza's life. That's all. Thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you, Álvaro. Thank you very much. I think we will have a nice discussion afterwards, because the other day the therapeutical aspect of specifically diary keeping and more broadly life writing was something that we have the opportunity to discuss about. So let's talk about later. Without further ado, I'm going to introduce our next speaker, Maria Pereira Branco. Maria Pereira is a DPhil candidate in modern languages at the University of Oxford. Her research, shaped by a comparative approach, focuses on the analysis of the literary works of writers Sofia de Mello and Natália Correia. Before starting her doctorate, she completed a master's at Oxford, and Maria also holds the diploma in translation in English, Portuguese, and a bachelor's degree in English literature from the University of Westminster. Maria's broader research interests include Lusophone literature, women's writing, and gender and sexuality. And today, I didn't anticipate Álvaro's title. I'm sorry. Today, Maria is presenting a paper titled Revolution Within and Without, the Transformative Power of Life Writing in Natália Correia's Now Percas Rosa. Thank you very much, Maria.
Hi, everyone. And thank you, Annie and Raquel, for this opportunity. I'm just going to share my PowerPoint. Can everyone see it? Yes?
Yes.
Well, perfect. So today I'm talking about revolution within and without, the transformative power of life writing in Natália Correia's diary, Não Percas a Rosa. So, Natália Correia was a prolific Portuguese writer, poet, publisher, amongst other things, who played a crucial role in resisting the new state dictatorship in Portugal. Renowned for her fearless opposition to the authoritarian rule, she actively challenged the regime through literature, political activism, public defiance, positioning herself as one of the most outspoken critics of Portugal's repressive regime. As a prominent intellectual, Correia's work engaged critically with the ideological and moral foundations of the new state, directly confronting its values, censorship policies, and restrictions on individual freedoms. Her literary production was deeply subversive, reflecting a commitment to the defense of women's rights, freedom, and freedom of expression. A frequent target of censorship, she became the most censored female writer under the regime and faced legal persecutions for her publications. So the little row of small books are all the books that were censored or forbidden to be published, so never made the shelves. And the two books in bigger size. So the Antologia de Poesia Portuguesa Erótica Satírica, so Anthology of Portuguese erotical and satirical poetry from 1965, led her for a suspended sentence, prison sentence for abuse of freedom of the press. And in 72, she was further prosecuted for her role as the editor of Novas Cartas Portuguesas, New Portuguese Letters, a case that gained international recognition and underscored the intersection of political and patriarchal repression in Portugal. And it was the case known as the Three Marias, because the authors were the three named Maria. And yeah, beyond her literary contributions, Correia was a central figure in Lisbon's intellectual and artistic circles, creating spaces for political and cultural dissidents. Her renowned establishment, functioned as a hub for writers, artists, and politicians who were opposed to the dictatorship, including individuals who frequented the Botequim, who would later be instrumental in the Carnation Revolution. Correia was engaged in political activism, using her literary works as a vehicle for political critique under the new state. Employing sophisticated metaphors and allegorical language, she denounced the policies of the new state regime and its leader, António de Oliveira Salazar. Despite facing the constant threats of imprisonment and surveillance by the secret police, the PID, she remained resolute in her opposition, distinguishing herself as one of the intellectuals who openly confronted the regime. It is important to highlight that Correia has engaged with life writing prior to composing this diary. As evidenced by her work, Descobri que era europeia, I found out I was European, which was written in 1951, when Correia was only 26 years old. And here she intervenes elements of diary, essay, poetry, and recounts her travels to the United States of America. On the other hand, this diary, the diary analyzed in this presentation, began to be written in 1974, as the Carnation Revolution was taking place. So it started on the 25th of April. Não Percas a Rosa functions as both a historical testimony of the post-revolutionary period and a deeply personal document of self-discovery. By resisting the conventional structure of diary writing, Correia offers a unique perspective on the revolutionary events of 25th of April and the impact on her personal transformation. This diary stands as an expression of her subjective truth rather than an objective historiographical account, as she mentions in the diary, blending literary artistry with political critique. In an interview, Correia once stated, o que é ser o cotidiano de um escritor, neste caso, de uma escritora, se não principalmente escrever? Não é bem assim, eu direi. Essencialmente viver para que haja honestidade, conhecimento profundo da vida naquilo que transmite aos outros. Certainly, for Correia, living is the best way for one to truly get to know oneself. But life writing for this author has served as a strong catalyst for her self-discovery. In this diary, Correia introduces a prefatory section, brevemente breve, written on June 1978, so written after the last entry of the diary. Here, she states that what this diary ultimately foregrounds is her self-discovery. And she states, maioritariamente destaco nesta trajetória a aprendizagem que nela fui fazendo de mim mesma. During the dictatorship, Correia constantly fought for freedom. It is interesting to examine how the external revolution of April 25, 74 influenced her internal transformation as a writer and as a woman. Through her diary, she comes to realize that her ultimate adversary is not a specific tyrant, in this case, Salazar, but tyranny in all its forms. In her first diary entry, written on the day of the revolution, she recounts a conversation with her mother. E nós vamos voltar a ser deuses, mãe, quando formos livres. O tio diz que a liberdade é impossível. Isso dizem os ladrões dos caminhos do sangue. O sangue sabe e infinitivamente corre para a verdade que o chama por detrás do cenário pintado da vida. Quem pinta um cenário, mãe? Os tiranos. Quem são os tiranos? Os usurpadores do presente. Compreendo, mãe. É preciso acreditar no impossível para haver presente. Eu vou ser livre na prática cotidiana de um sonho difícil. Promete-te ficar de pé nas pernas de um projeto de Deus. Assim me predestinas à terrível fascinação de viver. Ultimately, she envisions her idealized version of Portugal. So a land of true freedom, and she never seems to fight for it. 2 days after the revolution, so on the 27th of April, Correia states, enchem-se as ruas de jubílio, destemem-se os corpos, apertam-se as mãos desconhecidas, trocas de sorrisos e cravos gravam a marca da liberdade nesta hora de prata. Não vai ela fugir. Although in the first 3 entries, Correia is inundated by the joy of being liberated from the new state regime she fought so much against, reality soon dawns upon her. In the entry of the 1st of May of this year, she observes the different political forces trying to gain the people's support, and she is distrustful of their true intentions and of the survival of freedom. From this point onwards, the diary exposes the injustices being committed. Contrary to many retellings of the post-revolutionary period, here she exposes the reality that she sees around her, the murdering of former political police officers, the occupation of houses. Even Correia was threatened to have her apartment occupied, the torture of people who not align with the extremist left-wing revolutionaries, the power-hungry politicians, and the ultimate neglect of people's desires, she states. Quanto mais ouço esta chinfrineira diária das manifestações, que não dão pausa à vida da cidade e aos meus pobres ouvidos, mais me apercebo de que é nesta gritaria nutridora das hienas da revolução que se afoga a vontade do povo. Freedom at this period was not secure and injustice were being committed. Therefore, for Natália, she saw only one choice, which was to denounce them. Following the revolution, and concurrently with the writing of this diary, Correia was invited to contribute with a column in the newspaper A Capital. Much like her diary, these pieces served as a vehicle for critique, allowing her to articulate her opinions and expose injustices in the post-revolutionary period. As she articulates in one of her Crónicas Vagantes, the impetus to expand her literary output beyond poetry stemmed from a pressing need to safeguard freedom. Here, she explains how poetry is distanced from the political impurities and that in order to truly safeguard freedom, it is necessary to use prose that is more adaptable to political questions and therefore its message becomes more understandable by its reader. The pervasive fear of reprisal for opposing revolutionary forces led many Portuguese to remain silent, refraining from expressing dissident opinions. Correia, however, constantly voiced her opposition to the injustices she observed in this post-revolutionary period. In her diary, she criticizes those who, unlike herself, were perpetually afraid to speak out, both before and after the revolution, and underscores her commitment to maintaining a column in a capital as a means to preserve her voice. Até aqui, tinham medo de se pôr de pé. Era fascismo. Mas há alguém que ousa dizer umas verdades ao canonizado MFA. Alguém que não esperou que Salazar morresse para lhe enviar recado público, em sátira impressa, do seu tédio por um nepotismo mediocratizado. Alguém que não se prestou ao jogo de maricas de entrelinhada contestação, mas disparou o seu arco pelos arganazes, pomposamente chamados fascistas, em palavras de inequívoca repulsa que acertavam no odioso alvo. Diplomei-me demais no meu público horror pela fascistoide ditadura, para que, nas acusações que agora volvo contra os régulos da implicidade revolucionária, coloquem o selo de reacionarismo com que hermeticamente fecham todo e qualquer assomo de indignação contra os novos e reptilíneos opressores. Mantenho assim uma coluna em A Capital. This conviction of the necessity of speaking out against tyranny led to her post-revolutionary censorship, where her column for A Capital had to stop being published. Basically, the workers, acting against the director's authority, decided to carry out an act of censorship upon her. A fate she knew all too well, having suffered it repeatedly under the new state's lapis azul, as it was the color, the blue pencil, the color of the pen used by the censors under Salazar. Her persecution under two opposing political systems confirms her stance that power, when unchecked, breeds injustice, regardless of ideological affiliation. This event, however, did not prevent Correia from continuing her writing. Raul Rego founded a new morning newspaper, A Luta, and invited Correia to contribute a weekly column. She continued writing for the publication until March 1976, at which point she focused on other projects. Notably, by 1976, democracy had been secured. Otherwise, it is unlikely that Correia would have ceased writing. Correia, much like during the New State, in this post-revolutionary period, found herself under surveillance by those in power. As stated in the diary entry of November 15, 1975, she affirms that her loved ones are worried for her, as she is, without a doubt, inscribed in, and I quote, the lista dos indesejáveis, the list of the undesirable, the unwanted. The recurrent threats, whether in written form or through the telephone, corroborated this, alongside teasing in public spaces and the repeated threats to occupy her house. Correia's literary oeuvre constitutes a fervent denunciation of totalitarianism in both its right-wing and left-wing manifestations. Within this diary, she condemns the hypocrisy of revolutionary factions that outthrew one dictatorship only to instate another, remarking, a farsa de se engolir uma revolução que fechou os olhos a totalitarismo moribundo para engordar outro. For Correia, freedom is not a selective principle, it must be upheld in its entirety. One might question, what was Correia's intention of writing this diary? I contend that she wanted to publish it as soon as she started writing it. And she sought to position herself as a trailblazer by publishing what appears to be the first political diary written by a woman in Portugal in this post-revolutionary period. While other Portuguese women writers have published diaries, to the best of my knowledge, she was the first to publish a diary documenting the events of the post-revolutionary period. Although there were other published, but later on. So as far as as my research told me, That's the information. So during the dictatorship, Correia wrote numerous texts that, despite censorship, addressed themes of freedom and resistance. With the transition to the effective freedom in the post-Carnation Revolution period, she chose to document the unfolding of events and her reflections on the turbulent political climates that followed the regime's collapse. Her diary can be interpreted as both a testimony to disillusionment with the revolution and an exploration of the fragility of freedom. Having endured prolonged censorship, she seized the opportunity to fully exercise the freedom, although limited, available to her, ensuring that nothing remained unsaid. In doing so, she ultimately materialized the very freedom of expression which she had long fought for under the dictatorship. Historically, total justice, equality, and freedom have proven to be almost impossible to achieve. Nevertheless, Correia always held hope that one day this would happen, and that maybe her writings could contribute to this. Although her diary ends with the establishment of democracy shortly after the 25th of November 75, her activism continues, both as an MP and as a participant in Portugal's cultural life, and as a writer. As she mentions in a parliamentary debate in 1990, penso que tem de nascer uma nova cultura para que dela brote uma nova política. Through this process, Correia undergoes a profound journey of self-discovery. Writing the diary reveals to her that she will always fight against injustice, and as long as the world remains imperfect, it will always need a Natália Correia. Correia's complaints are not mere reactions to the political circumstances of her time. They are intrinsic to her identity as an author. She is not a great writer because of the dictatorship, rather she's one in spite of it. Her work consistently strives for an ideal, one that is, to some extent, utopian. The diary itself stands as proof of her relentless pursuit of true freedom. In any situation, she would unmask those who oppress others and restrict their freedoms, whether under the guise of the new state or left-wing revolutionary forces. She is, therefore, the ultimate defensor of freedom, guided solely by her own moral compass and bound by political affiliations or ideological constraints. The world will never be without injustice, and thus the role of the revolutionary, of the artist, thinker, must be perpetual. As she asserts in this diary, the revolution she envisions is not confined to a singular historical moment. Rather, it transcends temporal boundaries, aligning itself with the broader trajectory of human history and development. Não, a minha evolução não é esta. Ela irrompe onde a inteligência reconhece que o capitalismo e o socialismo banam de uma só fonte venenosa, que divide os seus cursos de água para iludir com sabores diferentes os que bebem a sua peçonha. A evolução já é de há muito, antiquíssima. Chama-se o homem. É equilateralizado na plenitude das suas 4 dimensões: espírito, intelecto, alma, corpo. Her insistence on criticizing injustice, regardless of its source, cements her as a figure of unwavering principle. She does not confine herself to external political struggles, but acknowledges that the true battleground for freedom is within the human spirit. This conviction underscores her lifelong defiance of oppressive forces, making Não Percas a Rosa not just a historical document, but an enduring testament to resistance and intellectual autonomy. Correia's unwavering commitment to freedom, whether against right-wing dictatorship or left-wing dogmatism, demonstrates her deep understanding that if power, if unchecked, inevitably leads to oppression. And thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Maria. Thank you for bringing a text that highlights the collective side of diary writing, which is something the life writing tradition tends to forget about. Thank you very much. I'm presenting next Vilma de Gasperin. Vilma is senior lecturer in Italian at the University of Oxford and lecturer in Italian and at Exeter College in Somerville College. She has published Laws and the Other, the visionary work of Anna Maria Ortese in Oxford University Press, and other essays exploring Ortese's intertextuality with works of other literatures, such as Ovid's Metamorphoses, Jorge Manrique's Coplas a la muerte de su padre, and Tolstoy's The Death of Ivan Ilyich. She worked on the autobiographical works of contemporary poet Vivian Lamarck and has published essays on the Italian language in Britain, particularly the works by Giuseppe Baretti. She is presenting today a paper titled Autobiography as Invention of the Self in Anna Maria Ortese's 1920s, 1950s, and beyond. Thank you very much, Vilma.
Thank you very much, Raquel. And Hani for inviting me to this series. And also thank you very much to Daniela Omnor. I think you're here for getting me in touch with Hani, which has led to being part of this wonderful series. And thank you, Hani, for sharing the screen for me. So, autobiography as invention of the self. Anna Maria Ortese lived from 1914 to 1998. I'll just start. Okay. She published her first poem and first story in 1933 and 34 at the age of 1920. These first texts were a literary response to a personal family tragedy, the death of her 20-year-old brother, Manuele. She spent her youth in Naples, where her family settled after time in Libya, and lived in Naples through the 30s and the end of the 40s. During her lifetime, she traveled a lot for work and changed cities frequently. She wrote articles and reportages for magazines, journals, and newspapers. Luca Clerici's biography lists over 500 pieces throughout 6 decades and a half. Her first book, the collection of short stories Angelici Dolori, came out in 1937. She went on to write several collections of short stories, essays, reportages, 2 of poetry, and 6 novels. 3 of these novels are autobiographical, in that they tell the story of a protagonist, Damasa and Tina, as she lives through major historical and social changes and experiences personal tragedies, love, and loss that can be mapped onto the author's biography. Above all, these novels are portraits of a writer in her youth and earlier womanhood. I'm going to talk about 2 of these novels from the 70s, Il Porto di Toledo and Il Cappello Piumato. Slide 2, please. Il Porto di Toledo tells the story of Damasa Figuera in Toledo. It was written between 1969 and 75 and was originally conceived as a rewriting with a commentary of her first collected short stories. It incorporates 9 of the 13 stories from Angelici Dolori and around 36 poems. As Ortese says, the commentary to the stories grew and took over what was initially meant as cheerful introduction to her early stories. These are her words. The novel was published in 1975, then again in 1985, and Ortese worked on a revised edition in her later years and published it in 1998, just before she died. Il Porto di Toledo depicts the years of Damasa between the early 30s until through the Second World War, and culminates with the bombing of Naples by the Allies in 1944 and a reference to the death of Mussolini, as well as depicting the aftermath of the war. In the literary, partly Hispanized transfiguration of the novel, Naples is Toledo. The Americans are Padri Biblici, biblical fathers. The airplanes from which the bombs are dropped are Uccelli Turchi, Turkish birds. And Mussolini is Don Pedro. The king, Vittorio Emanuele, is El Rey. Similarly, the protagonist's brother, Antonio, becomes Albe Garcia, the sister, Juana, and the Maestro d'Armi, who is the editor at the Literaria Gazzetta, La Fiera l'Italia Letteraria, where she published her first stories, is called Dorcas, from the painting by El Greco e l'Entierro del Conte Dorcas. The second novel, Cappello Piumato, tells the story of Bettina's life in the mid-50s in Milan, as shown by Monica Farnetti in the notes to the edited Romanzi and by Beatrice Manetti in her essay The Three Lives of Bettina, from Il Cappello Piumato to Poveri e Semplici and back. The textual history of this work is long. It is long, over 20 years, and non-linear. Ortese wrote the original manuscript over a month in December 59, January 1960. She published the first 40 pages as Poveri e Semplici in 1967. 20 years later, she worked on the remaining manuscript. She says, nel 78 ricucii un rapido manoscritto. I stitched up a quick manuscript and published it as Il Cappello Piumato in 1979. The two novels share the same protagonist, Bettina, the same narrator, Bettina, the same character, same city, and the plot of the second book follows on from the earlier novel. However, the narrator is in fact further split into two. As Giuliano Gramigna notes in his review from 1978, there are two narrators, that of the old manuscript and that of the new manuscript, and the latter comments on the former. Ortese denies openly that her autobiographical novels are autobiographical or true, or that the I, is herself. At the beginning of Ortese's first autobiographical novel, Poveri e Semplici, she writes the following note to the reader, the avvertenza, slide 3. La necessità di riuscire a rendere più vivamente una situazione o un personaggio ha suggerito la forma autobiografica di questo racconto, che perciò deve intendersi come una normale narrazione di fatti e luoghi immaginari. Similarly, in Il Porto di Toledo, she denies it is an autobiographical story with truth. Slide 4. Tutto il racconto, d'avvio autobiografico non era in realtà, ma un personaggio che io non avevo previsto all'inizio si era sostituito al mio io reale, quello che ora scrive questa nota, portando il racconto, in modo neppure questo previsto, fino alla fine. So she wrote this in the dust jacket of Il Porto di Toledo in 75. In the second edition, 10 years later, Ortese writes a nota which reinforces this point. Next slide. Mi impegnai dunque a scrivere un libro di memoria e come lo pensai venne fuori questa damasa, a me sconosciuta. Tutto il resto di Toledo lo conoscevo. Questa damasa non l'avevo mai veduta. Prese il mio posto nella casa del Pilar e descrisse tutto come a me non sarebbe mai potuto accadere. La guardavo allibita. So there is a replacement of the character in the self. Finally, in the introductory text to the last edition of Il Porto di Toledo, entitled An, le aggiunte e mutamento, the additions and change, Ortese author takes charge of the invention of her protagonist character. Next slide. La vecchia natura delle cose non mi andava. Inventai dunque una me stessa, che voleva un'aggiunta al mondo, che gridava contro la pianificazione ottimale della vita. These passages by Ortese, written at a distance of 10 or 15 years, one from another, show a constant and coherent concept of the literary self character as an other, the consequence of a splitting. But whereas in the earlier comments, Ortese expresses a sense of bafflement and an almost passive acknowledgement of such surprising effect of autobiographical narration, in 1998, she culminates, as seen in the last quotation, declaring a self-conscious act of invention. Inventai una me stessa. I invented a self. who wanted to rebel against the status quo through her writing. This echoes what has been identified by Fausta Garavini as the workings of autobiography. Next slide. Le memorie personali si staccano dagli ormeggi del vissuto, dalle banchine della biografia. La scrittura traghetta il soggetto verso l'altrove, al di là dell'orizzonte quotidiano, nelle contrade dell'invisibile, verso un se stesso che non conosce. Towards an unknown self. Lo scrittore così si metamorfosa in personaggio. Similarly, in the first chapter of Il Cappello Piumato, which acts as a bridge, the chapter between the previous Poveri e Semplici and Il Cappello Piumato, Ortese addresses the problem of this invented, autonomous, autobiographical I. Slide 8. Questo personaggio era proprio colui che scrive, il fastidiosissimo e ormai usualissimo io narrante. E se in qualche tratto del tutto remoto mi somigliava, non poteva dirsi il mio io certamente. Mi era vicino, questo sì, ma chi non ha scorto di sé, di quando in quando, una minor parte, un frammento di se stesso in certo senso, più autonomo e vivo? In a further act of distancing Bettina from herself, Ortese likens her personaggio io, herself, to the poetic figure of a dead woman, a ghost. Slide 9. Avrei detto di lei, di Bettina, so this is the narrator speaking about the narrator of Il Porto, speaking about the narrator from the manuscript. Avrei detto di lei, se non mi avesse trattenuta un senso del limite, ciò che il poeta del Corvo dice di Irene morta. Re chi meraviglia a questi alberi, ed è strano il tuo pallore, strana la tua veste. By quoting Edgar Allan Poe's poem The Sleeper and likening Bettina to Irene, Ortese paints herself in the strangeness and wonder of a ghost, while claiming at the same time that this fragment is more alive than she is. We have considered the two protagonists. Let us now turn to the stories and the setting and the times that are depicted in these two novels. In Il Porto di Toledo, Damasa suffers the tragic death of her brothers. Manuele, in 1933, died falling from a ship's mast near Martinique Island, and Antonio, her twin brother, was murdered in 1940 in Albania. She goes through fascism, evacuation and displacement, the destruction of the war, separation and grief. She also discovers writing and finds a new sense to her life, the possibility of lifting herself above the nothingness into which she feels she's born. Through writing, she can shape her experience and find relief and hope for a future. But the novel ends with an overbearing sense of huge loss suffered, of family, of her own youth. I'll give one example from the end of the novel, when Albe, the brother, returns to Toledo. Juana, the protagonist's sister, has seen him alive in her dreams. She has dreamt of him and is hoping and believes he will come back, he will return. Next slide. Alle 8 bussano. È la posta, una lettera. Non Albe, no. Il Ministero dei Defunti, gestito ora dai padri biblici. Decisero, d'accordo con lo Stato turco, di restituire ai toledani e altri cittadini del vicereame tutti gli scarti o residui atti del conflitto, anche eventuali corpi dei marine. Individuarono Albe sotto l'ulivo e ora, con tanti altri, l'hanno imbarcato. Giungerà presto in Toledo. Si trovino i Figuera all'arrivo. And when the sister goes to meet her brother, she sees tante cassettine erano allineate ed erano come bare di bamboline. After the war, Ortese joined for a few years the Communist Party. In Il cappello piumato, Bettina describes herself as una giovane scrittrice comunista. There are no dates in the novel, which is, however, set in a specific temporal frame. 3 of Ortese's journey that took place in 1954-55 are recounted. The journey to the Soviet Union with the Delegazione dell'Unione Donne Italiane in 1954, in order to write a reportage for the magazine L'Europeo, the trip to Sicily to write an article in 1955, and her taking part in the Giro d'Italia as a reporting journalist also in 1955. These, Il Treno Rosso, Montelebre, and Giro d'Italia, were later collected in La Lente Scura, Racconti di Viaggio. Il cappello piumato is the story of a threefold crisis, of a love relationship, of political ideals, and of writing. The novel begins with Bettina and Gillia's symbolic wedding, what she calls nozze di carta, wedding of paper. And it depicts their life together, the happiness followed by gradual distancing and separation, and also the constant money problems, the worries to pay the bills. Gilliat also is a writer, a journalist working for the communist newspaper Foma, which is a transfiguration of l'Unità. He's a former partner who took part in the resistance. He's also referred to as El Quinto from the Spanish song Il Quinto Regimiento. At the start of the novel, Bettina is more naive in terms of political and historical awareness compared to her companion. Slide 11. Next slide, please. Thank you. Also, thank you. La resistenza non sapevo che fosse. La storia d'Italia nemmeno. Improvvisamente sapevo tutto. E quanto avevamo sofferto e tutto ciò che non eravamo stati o potevamo ancora essere. Brackets. Nota dell'autore. Incredibile. Era pazza realmente questa Bettina. So this is the narrator of Il cappello piumato reading the manuscript and thinking about this Bettina, and narrator and character. Incredible, and not recognizing her. She was mad. Both Bettina and Gilliat are increasingly disillusioned by communism for different reasons. Bettina shifts from hope and idealization of the Soviet Union to growing doubts on the ethical implications of communism, to the fall of ideals with Khrushchev and the first signs of the Hungarian Revolution and its repression in 1956. Bettina's unease concerns not just communism and the party, to which she did not belong at the time, as she writes, and which made it difficult for her, she says, to really talk about it with militants, but also the modern industrial society of the 50s, which contributes to her crisis as a writer. Next slide. Sempre meno io trovavo nella società industriale il terreno adatto a intingervi, per così dire, la penna. Il nulla e la società industriale erano per me tutt'uno. She portrays the anxiety of publishing, the precariousness of living off a writer's earnings, and the ensuing constant anxiety for the present and the future. She talks of mancanza di denari, lack of money, la pigione da pagare, the bills and the rent to pay, il terrore dell'avvenire, the terror of the future. Drawing towards a conclusion, these two novels portray the life experience of Damaso and Bettina in two different periods of the author's personal and literary life and of Italian society. At the same time, they go beyond the defined time frame of the narrated times, i.e. the 30s, 40s in Il Porto di Toledo and the 50s in Il Cappello. These novels go beyond also the preoccupation on the self. in il cappello piumato, she writes, next slide, please. Nel dicembre del 60, trovandomi a Milano, mi venne in mente di scrivere un racconto dedicato allo spavento di vivere nei suoi confini attuali, che sono
I think we might have lost Vilma temporarily. Raquel, can you hear Vilma? Or have we lost?
No, I thought it was my internet.
I thought it was mine too, but I'm not sure it is. We'll just wait a minute and hopefully Vilma will
Yeah.
rejoin us. Good, I think she's just left, so hopefully she'll rejoin. Sorry, everyone. Hopefully it'll just be a second or a couple of seconds. Okay, I can't get hold of her, but I'm sure she'll be back in a couple of minutes. I wonder, Raquel, is it worth taking a couple of initial questions for Maria and Álvaro, just while Vilma rejoins us?
Yeah, that would be great. Let's start the Q&A and then hopefully Vilma can start over.
Great. So first of all, thank you so much, Álvaro and Maria, for two really stimulating papers. It was fascinating, I thought, to see those very different uses of the diary form in both cases, but both striving towards a very interesting kind of coherence. In fact, I might stop short there because I think we have Vilma back with us. Great, Vilma, thank you. And you can pick right up where you left.
Sorry.
That's fine.
Okay, where was I? Okay, we were at the buio filosofico in cui viviamo. Note that she uses, I was saying she's noi and the present tense and not the past. So writing about the past about the past self serves to pose broader questions on the purpose of human life in changing times. Next slide, please, honey. Ero costretta a farmi una domanda in quel tempo. Accettavo o non accettavo la vita in questa società? E dovevo rispondermi che non l'accettavo. Essa mi pareva orribilmente priva di finalità umane. Ma se guardavo intorno ad altri paesi, come l'America e la Russia, vedevo che anche lì andava smarrendosi qualsiasi ricordo di una finalità umana. Non solo l'Occidente, ma anche l'Oriente s'avviava verso una civiltà puramente meccanica, da cui la libertà di realizzarsi come persona era esclusa. This is a crisis that goes beyond the self, beyond Milan, beyond Italy. it is looking at the world, America, Russia. Similarly, her writing, the autobiographical writing of Il Porto di Toledo, acquires the meaning of a revolution against the boundaries imposed by history, society, and social class. Next slide, please. Toledo non è dunque una storia vera, non è un'autobiografia, è rivolta e reato davanti alla pianificazione umana, alla sola dimensione umana che ci è stata lasciata. And on the last slide, I would like to focus on a few words or phrases by Ortese. Next slide, please, Hani. And I would like to conclude by looking at these concepts. These autobiographical novels, through a reinvention of the past self, an independent, autonomous, alive, invented other self, carry the social critique to society and to civilization from the past to the present, and from the past fictional invented fragment self to a broader human dimension, and asks what is the finalità umana and what is the dimensione umana that is left during these times of philosophical darkness in which we live. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. And congratulations for dealing that well with the technological inconveniences. Thank you very much. I thought that this work again is extremely. Thank you for presenting us with a work that I didn't know about, and that it's so rich in intertextuality. Thank you. So I pass it over to Hani for starting officially our Q&A.
Great. Thank you all so much again. So just before you came back in, Vilma, we were talking about the question of form and questions of coherence versus fragmentation that I found so striking across these three papers in terms of what's going on with purpose, especially, but there were wider parallels, I think, in terms of this interrogation of temporality, question of the individual versus the collective, that are in fact emerge in very different ways across the three texts. So thank you all again, and we'll open up to the floor if anyone's got any questions, either for all three of our speakers or for one in particular. Raquel.
Oh no. Let's let Richard ask.
Okay, we'll go to Richard and then Raquel. Thanks, Richard.
Thanks very much, Hani, and congratulations to all three presenters. A really fascinating session. I mean, one of the things which occurred to me, one of the uniting factors perhaps, is the understanding of humanism on part of all three authors. I mean, a very European Enlightenment, of course, concept. But particularly I wanted to focus on just ask a couple of very brief questions. I know we've only got 15 minutes, so very brief questions for Maria and her paper on Natália Correia. I thought it was very interesting, something you didn't comment on and didn't perhaps come through in the translation of one of the pieces there, and the criticism of the revolutionary days of in the post-April 1974 revolution was Correia's criticism of the jogo de maricas in her words. And I wondered, it's quite interesting because she felt clearly excluded by some of the discourses on the extreme left, but also she was prepared to use terms such as those, and without engaging in anachronistic critique. We're talking 50 years ago, of course. I wondered if that was something which we could perhaps examine here. And the second thing was, as you were towards the end of your paper, Maria, which I enjoyed very much, you talked about you've quoted Correia again to talk about the revolution of man, spirit, intellect, soul, and body. And as you were reading through that quotation, I mean, for some reason, I don't know whether you find it useful, but it just occurred to me that this was very similar to some of the thought articulated by Maria Zambrano from a similar period. So I don't know whether there's something here which is perhaps useful, women philosophers who are looking at those sort of questions. Anyway, that's it. Thanks very much, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you for your question. Actually, the last comment you said, I am not familiar with that philosopher, so I'm definitely going to take a look at it. Thank you. And regarding her language, so Correia, in anything, obviously, within the dictatorship, she wrote things in a more metaphorical way, so to say, because obviously she couldn't say things as directly. But even with that, within this whole censorship situation, she would say things very, very straightforward. And this type of terms that she would use here, I think she's using jogo de maricas, like the word maricas, like someone who is afraid. Ser maricas in the being afraid. And she uses a lot of like these little expressions throughout her work. She is obviously a very elaborate writer. She doesn't use the language in a simple way at all. So I think this is just like a perfect example of how she uses different, from colloquial terms to really high Portuguese, and mix it all together. But I think the important thing to bear in mind is that she always said whatever, whenever. She was very, very not afraid to say anything in any way. And I think even this quotation that you pointed out here is a good example of it, that she's just ready to do so.
Thank you so much, Richard. That's really fascinating. And I can see that Jay has written in the chat that is this a way of materializing thoughts, this use of metaphor?
Yeah, I think that basically, so in the quotations I provided, obviously this is in her diary. So here she's being more direct. And I think she just is using more language as a way of making it more embellished, more maybe for artistic, like poetic, literary focus. But beforehand, for example, I mentioned she has a quotation that I pointed out as well, and she says, "Because I was not afraid to point out things that were wrong in the fascism. I was not afraid to say to satirize Salazar. For example, she wrote a play which is obviously censored called O Homúnculo, in which she represents Salazar as this bird, and that is like eating his like the Portuguese people, and is making the Portugal the touristic destination of death. And so, for example, in that play, which I think it's genius work, it's amazing. I really recommend it. It's the metaphor to be able to say exactly what she wants to say, but she just puts metaphors to be able to say it without being okay. We really need to incarcerate her. Although, fun enough, with that play, apparently Salazar was aware of it, and they were planning on arresting her. And then he said to the head of the like police forces, I'm not saying the wrong name, he said like, oh, censor the work, of course, but do not touch her, because she's extremely intelligent. And obviously my comment, because she had a lot of connections. So I think that's how she remained not incarcerated during the dictatorship. That's what I think, honestly.
Wow, what a fascinating writer. Yes, Sean, you have a question, potentially picking up on the Zambrano link.
No, the Zambrano, I think it's absolutely right, the connection there. But again, I wanted to thank the speakers for 3 wonderful papers, contributions, and also to you, Hani, because the contextualization and the framing was very useful. I wanted to ask Álvaro very briefly, because obviously he referred to the metaphor, and immediately it brings the illness as metaphor. Susan Sontag essay of the 70s that had an enormous impact, and where she challenged this sort of victim blaming. And I wonder if that memoir addresses that aspect of because then we would be closer to the idea of rebeldía. It's very paradoxical. And I agree with Álvaro that wondering what is exactly the meaning in that sort of word, because you cannot say illness as a rebeldía to this sort of blaming and victimization. Say, well, that the victim is to blame. So that was, and also to thank him, because I had no idea of this pioneering, what is called now the sick lit, that it has become such an important trend in this century. But that was quite an early cursor, as it were, and I cannot think of any others really. So thank you very much, and that's it.
I couldn't find anything similar either, at least not in Spanish, and not from the time. Regarding the idea of metaphor, yes, she makes reference to it. She doesn't make any reference to Susan Sontag that I've been able to track really. Cristina Areilza doesn't. She makes reference she's quite an articulate thinker, and she thinks a lot about thinking and suffering illness. So despite the diary not being very theoretical, it's nothing like Audre Lorde's, where there are bits of proper sort of reflection. It's more just daily thoughts and things, but intertwined there are some ideas about this, about metaphors. So for example, I opened it randomly, and she's talking here on page 77 about the symbolism of cats. So yes, there's a lot of like the ideas on metaphor. The main one that I've identified throughout the narration is the one of battle. And that does link, as you say, with this idea of rebeldía. I'm tempted to think, looking at the diary as a whole, that the rebeldía means a rebelliousness against the hospital and the medical establishment, which I think she is very keen on when she publishes the diary. Because, for example, the remarks about how she wants to be left alone in nature, and how she stopped her treatment, etc., herself, are done after the writing of the diary.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you both. A really excellent question, John, and really fascinating response as well, Álvaro. I think Catherine, you've got a question.
Yes, thank you very much, and apologies for coming late to this conversation because I have some other commitments. But I have a question for Vilma, if that's okay. And I was really, thank you for what was a really brilliant paper, and I was really intrigued by one of the quotes, and this general sense of doubling which emerges in Ortese's sort of projecting an autobiographical other into her works. And in particular, I was interested in the quote on, or when she says, la vecchia natura delle cose non mi andava, inventai dunque una me stessa che voleva un'aggiunta al mondo. So she was inventing an other self to sort of break the limitations of reality. And I was wondering whether you see that sitting, or where you see that sitting rather, with the magical realist dimension of her writing, because in terms of magical realism being a kind of perhaps something that which goes beyond what reality can offer us, and which is also sort of opening up a space to accommodate a kind of vortex of emotions or of loss, which is something you talked about, that cannot be contained in the realist dimension. So I was really interested in that sense of doubling and how you see that relating to the fantastic element and the magic realist element in her works.
Thank you, Catherine. Thank you. Wow, there's a lot here. So Ortese was initially, as you know, associated with magic realism, particularly with Angelici Dolori. And then she wrote fantastic genre, fantastic stories, short stories and novels. So L'Iguana, Alonso I Visionari, Il Cardillo Addolorato. Il Cardillo Addolorato is a later novel from 1993. There is an elf, there are apparitions, it's an 18th century fairy tale. So that, she was always, I think, she started writing realist stories in the late 40s, early 50s, and she's particularly within Mare non bagna Napoli, because she declares, she claims that's what she felt she was asked to do at the time, particularly being part of the Gruppo Sud. And but later, especially also given the huge polemic that in Mare non bagna Napoli caused in depicting realtà, she says in the 70s, my favorite genre is il fantastico, and I can talk about reality better through the fantastico. The other, but the more I go on with Ortese, so there are like three broad categories. So there is il fantastico, realismo, and autobiografia. And broadly, but the more you go into Ortese's work, the more you see that these boundaries are not really there. That autobiography might really be talking about realism and fantasy, and the other way around. Fantasy, L'Iguana, L'Alonso I Visionari, and Il Cardillo Addolorato, which are considered fantastic stories, non-realist, actually deal with some of the aspects I talked about today, and some of the aspects she talks about in the realist stories. So injustice, oppression, discrimination, marginalization. So that is in terms of genre. So whether even magic realism is not a category we can really fit her in. The other thing about the quote you mentioned, la vecchia natura delle cose non mi andava, she refers specifically, so that is on on Il Porto di Toledo. And the title of that that text, the introduction that she wrote later in 1998, Anne, le aggiunte e il mutamento. Now, who's Anne? Anne Hurdle is the dedicatee of the novel, dedicated to Anne Hurdle. She was a girl who was hanged in England at the end of the 18th century because of forgery. She forged money. Benjamin Constant, in his diaries, talks about that. And she dedicates, in 75, you just have this dedication to Anne Hurdle. And then she writes Anne, l'aggiunta al mutamento, and she makes a parallel between Anne, who didn't have something, and she forged it, and she was executed for that, and what literature can do. And she says, I wanted to write a novel like reato, like a transgression, almost a crime of adding to reality. And throughout the novel, she talks about, but throughout her work, what is realtà? And very often realtà is not, so The subtitle of Il Porto di Toledo is Ricordi della vita irreale. And so what is reale very often is less real or true than what is non reale or fantastico or unaggiunta. So she specifically says autobiography is, she's adding this, she's creating it, and that is more real. I don't know if I've answered. Thank you for the question.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Very detailed answer. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you both. Yeah, I'm so struck by that self-reflexive play that you elaborated so beautifully, Vilma, in this paper. I feel like we could talk for hours just about that, in fact. Raquel, shall I hand over to you for one last question or comment?
Yeah, just very, very quickly. I'd like to address a topic we haven't addressed yet, and I think it's important if we consider the comparative perspective of this seminar series, and it's translation into English. While I was listening to Álvaro, to Maria, and especially to Vilma, presented in about a novel, two novels. I was thinking, how would the translation of this text, would the translation of this text make a change on how life writing is perceived? Will this the translations of this text to English be meaningful for promoting a debate on Southern European countries? Is it worth it? Is it worth to translate these diaries? Because, for example, the problem with diaries is sometimes they are quite long, and I find myself reflecting about these facts quite often. So let's see if any of you want to reflect on translation.
I mean, I think my gut feeling from the one I'm talking about, for Diario de una rebeldía, is that it would work. I think it's a text that speaks to the suffering of illness in very, I think sometimes, well, in very, I would say delocalized in terms of cultural references, but it does make tons of references to the hospital setting, which I think, I mean, I wouldn't dare say it's universal, but it is very same, at least across Western countries, I would say. It is very simple. So I think there's that. In fact, I can see, yeah. So yeah, I think it would work. Now, the thing with the Diario de Cristina Areilza, however, is that, I mean, let alone the translation, it hasn't been republished ever since. And I haven't asked around, but I sense sometimes diaries like this one in particular about illness are taken with a bit of apprehension by the public, and they might not sell as much as they might like. I should say, though, that this one's short. It's only 137 pages, so it's not long at all.
Thanks, Álvaro. Vilma and Maria, do you have any thoughts on the translations of these texts and its merits?
Well,
Vilma, yes.
Il Porto di Toledo is not very short. It's over 500 pages. It would be, it has been translated into English, I think, and German was the latest one. Not into English. It would be very interesting also because the language itself would pose a huge challenge. It's not, well, there's no such thing as ordinary normal Italian, but the syntax, the vocabulary, the morphology is modified. Ortese describes it as linguaggio deformato, spezzato, like broken up, fractured again. And the idea of fracture actually makes me think that she talks of il porto di Toledo as fractured in two, spezzato in due. Yeah.
Thanks, Vilma. And Maria, what are your thoughts?
So this diary hasn't been translated. I think it is interesting. It would be interesting, but I do think we would need, in the specific case of Natália, to have more of her other works as well translated. And it is very much specific to the Portuguese political situation. So I am not 100% sure on how much the foreign public would adhere to it, but yeah.
And Claudia, I think you want to come in there.
Yes, I do. Sorry, I'm not on screen. I just want to say that, we need to have far more women translated. We also need to be a little bit strategic about it. And that's the difficulty, isn't it? So obviously people, certainly Natália was just so rebellious that she's only just beginning to be translated into English now. So I think it's a question of, have they missed the boat forever? Because, the diary is a diary around the revolution. So, to what extent is it still relevant today? And it's such a funny diary for a Portuguese person, read, sort of with hindsight. But yes, I do concur with Maria that we need to be very, very strategic. That said, there should be more room. And I think what we really need to look at is the diaries that are being written now and that are not being translated because they are by women. Diaries or memoirs or autobiography, there is still a gender gap in terms of what is being translated. And we need to narrow that.
Absolutely. And Jean is expressing her agreement in the chat. And I think that's a really brilliant note to end on, in fact, that need for more translation, for more of these works to enter into those international discussions is absolutely crucial. So I think all that's left to say is a huge thank you to Álvaro, to Maria, to Vilma, and to you all for a really fantastic discussion today. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here. It means a lot to us, and it really means a lot to our speakers as well. So thank you so much, and we hope to see you again next week. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.